Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, my fine friends. Welcome to episode 0 of season 11 of the Tom Petty Project podcast. I'm your host, Kevin Brown. This is the weekly podcast that digs into the entire Tom Petty catalogue, song by song, album by album, and includes conversations with musicians, fans, and people connected with Tom along the way. So I enjoyed previewing season 10 and talking about Wildflowers before we started digging into the songs and figured, you know what, let's do that for each season moving forward. So I'm going to split this episode into two halves or two parts. The first will be a little bit of an intro to this album, in case you're not familiar or you're less familiar with it. And the second half or the second part will then be my comments on the movie, which I've never seen and I'm watching for the first time so that I can give you my thoughts for the podcast. So hopefully this will be interesting for all of us. Okay, so let's talk about this album a little. It's one that I overlooked almost completely when I got into Petty and started listening back through his catalogue and sort of getting myself up to speed. I think mostly because I saw the word soundtrack and thought, you know, it's going to be mainly instrumentals and maybe one or two original songs. So I'll check it out at some point, but I didn't really prioritize listening to it. Later on, I would discover that Tom really wasn't happy with the end result and didn't tour this album, which is the only time in his career he hasn't hit the road to help promote a new record. The album did come hot off the heels of Tom's biggest undertaking, obviously, in Wildflowers, and he was contacted by Ed Burns, the writer, director, and star of the movie, who wanted him to come in and score the film. So Tom was initially hesitant, but after throwing on the unscored movie, he says, late one night and enjoying it, he decided to meet with the 28-year-old filmmaker who was making only his second movie as a writer and director at that point. There is interview/documentary footage of Tom talking about this process and in-studio conversation about which way the score should go at certain points. So my hope is that one day we get a full release on this album in a similar vein to Somewhere You Feel Free. Of course, this album isn't in the same league as Wildflowers, but to me, it's in some ways it's more fascinating because of the circumstance, how it was sort of put together and the tracks that ended up on it. It's a really interesting part of Tom's life. So I think a little documentary, even if it's just an hour, would be super cool. So the first thing that really interests me is that Tom convened the Heartbreakers to work on this project rather than making it another solo effort. So, rather than sitting with, say, Michael Kamen to orchestrate and work through a typical score, Tom worked directly with the Heartbreakers alongside a few additional musicians and Ed Burns to craft the soundtrack. In conversations with Tom Petty, Tom tells author Paul Zollo that his original intention was to call a bunch of other musicians to see if they had any songs that he could use and to act as more of a musical director than a composer. But he says that he realized that no one was going to give him their best material that they could release and use themselves, so he rethought the approach. Also at this time, Tom had finalized his divorce from Jane, was a bachelor again, and had wrapped up the Wildflowers tour and was living alone for the first time in years in what he affectionately dubbed the Chicken Shack, which was a small log cabin in the Palisades, a stone's throw west of Santa Monica. So quite how Benmont, Mike, and Howie came to be involved is very interesting to me. I wonder if it was just a case of, I don't want to do this on my own, and I'm not exactly sure how to tackle this. I've never done a film before, so I'll bring in my safety net, the guys who know how I work. Excluded from this group, however, is Steve Ferrone, who still wasn't a fully fledged Heartbreaker at this point, despite having toured the Wildflowers album. So in comes Kurt Biscayra to play drums for the soundtrack recording. Biscayra's impressive credentials include performing with Elton John at Madison Square Garden, as well as working as a session player for Bonnie Raitt, Mick Jagger, Buzz Skaggs, Josh Groban, a whole bunch of different players. Also coming in are Canadian rock violinist Lily Hayden and Michael Severance and Jerry Suchiak on cello. In the mini-documentary I watched, Tom says that Ed Burns gave him really wide latitude to go in whichever musical direction he wanted, and that around 80% of the soundtrack ended up being based on the songs that Tom wrote for the movie. Among those songs, of course, are the Petty Head staples Angel Dream and Walls, both of which I would put at Tom's very top table, personally. But the album also sees Tom in a very playful, Dylan-esque mood with the, a song that you could hear the Wilburys doing, Zero from Outer Space. And the brilliant Grow Up Fast also is on there, and the music for that song is used in the movie. Some songs written for the movie, though, ended up not being used. So I think that Tom eventually decided to release the whole thing. I, I almost think of it more of a companion piece rather than calling it truly a soundtrack album. I think is difficult because in some ways it's similar to Queen's A Kind of Magic, which is half Highlander soundtrack and half other songs that the band wanted to release around the same time. So songs and music from She's the One has that same kind of patchwork feel to it. You know, tracks like California, Hope You Never, Hung Up on Overdue, and Climb That Hill were actually taken from the Wildflowers sessions as tracks that didn't make the final cut of that album, and were included to round out things a little and make the overall album maybe a little bit more complete as a Heartbreakers record. However, this also slightly disjoints the album, making it part soundtrack and part anthology, as I said. And I think that actually having just the instrumental versions of a lot of the music from the album would be kind of cool because they're really nice arrangements. The album was reimagined as Angel Dream in 2021 as a more cohesive sounding Heartbreakers record, with the Wildflowers tracks removed because we'd obviously had those on the Wildflowers and All the Rest release, and 4 new songs brought into the mix. I find that Angel Dream is we'll say quote unquote, better album to listen to in some ways because it sounds more like a Heartbreakers album, but I wouldn't ever want to take She's the One out of the equation completely. This album's also quite hard to find, especially for a good price on vinyl, thus, my search continues. The album was released on August 8th, 1996 as Tom's second album for Warner Brothers, and it was produced by Tom, Mike, and Rick Rubin, who I don't think I've ever heard talk about it in any detail. It was recorded at Sound City in Van Nuys, Village Recorders in West LA, and Andorra Studios, also in Los Angeles. The album did hit number 15 on the Billboard 200 and 37 in the UK, while the singles, Walls, Circus, Climb That Hill, and Change the Locks, all hit the top 20 on the US mainstream rock charts. Again, Tom eschews the temptation to release the ballad from this album, Angel Dream. The album is also curious in having 2 different versions of 2 different songs on it. And of course, those of you who listen to the podcast regularly will know that this is the basis of one of my 10 questions that I give to people I talk to. So to close out this half or this part of the episode, I began by saying that I initially overlooked this album in my deep dive catalog discovery or journey with Tom, and as a result, I missed 2 songs that have become among my favorites. And I said I'm also fascinated by this album in a similar way that I'm fascinated by Hot Space by Queen or Van Halen 3. Songs and music from She's the One is a real outlier in Tom's catalog. It's a step away from Tom's comfort zone at a time when he was at a personal crossroads, and I think that despite his subsequent misgivings, it's a good collection of songs. It's not a particularly coherent album, but there's much to really enjoy about this eclectic mix of tracks. Okay, I just spent about an hour and a half watching a 90s rom-com, and I don't usually watch rom-coms. She's the One is Ed Byrne's second movie, as I said, I think earlier in the episode. It follows his directorial and acting debut in the 1995 movie The Brothers McCullen. The plot centers, almost as that movie does, around the relationships of the Long Island Fitzpatrick family. The star turn in the movie for me is John Mahoney of Frasier fame, who plays the Irish Catholic patriarch figure with a very deft hand, at turns slightly sexist, at others conflicted and unsure of himself despite his age. And I always really enjoyed watching Mahoney as the figurehead of the Crane household, the cranky Marty. And he tends to always be a reliable, solid pair of hands whenever he shows up in these smaller roles. So it was nice having a familiar face as an anchor in this movie. Ed Burns himself stars in the lead role as Mickey Fitzpatrick, a cabbie still meandering his way through life following a breakup with his ex-fiancée, Heather, played by a very young Cameron Diaz, appearing in only her third film. Mickey's brother Francis, or Franny, played by Mike McGlone, is a successful Wall Street hotshot married to Jennifer Aniston's Renee, but also having an affair with Heather, who he later leaves his wife for and proposes to, only to ultimately be rebuffed. Mickey, meanwhile, at the start of the film, picks up the free-spirited Hope, who has him drive her to a wedding in New Orleans in his cab. On their return, they inform the family that they married the day after they met at the wedding on the dance floor. This doesn't go over particularly well with the other 2 men in the family, and some conflict arises from that situation. So the film has pretty tried and tested foundations. Sibling rivalry between the year-older Mickey and Franny, who are always competing in life in different ways. Franny always looking up to Mickey despite all his bluster and bravado, Mickey being listless and non-committal to most things in his life, including in some regards to his new wife. All this is exacerbated by a father who likes to dole out advice despite his own marriage ending abruptly under his nose during the third act of the movie. There's nothing here that we haven't seen dozens of times before in rom-coms spanning decades. There's nothing new or particularly original really about the overarching plot, and yet there's definitely something compelling about the characters. Franny is having an affair and seems to be a completely unlikable character, but by the end of the movie, he's kind of shown to just be a very immature man-child playing the part of an adult, and despite his success, isn't confident, doesn't really know who he is or how to behave. Mickey finally takes a chance on Hope, who previously informed him of her plans to move to Paris, and Heather, meanwhile, marries a much older man who, it turns out, used to be one of her main clients during her time as a call girl paying her way through school. And so, look, none of this should really interest me. I don't watch this type of movie, in large part because the plots are always predictable and everything usually works out in the end. It's all very neat and all very tidy, and which life just generally tends not to be, right? And that happens here. So we get, not to give too many spoilers if you haven't seen the movie, but there is a happy ending in this one. But the cast, I think, in this one manages to rise above the general storyline. And I think it's where the dialogue does a lot of the heavy lifting in this movie, because it feels more honest than forced. There are some nice filmic devices with passages of conversations being interwoven so that you get the story in a linear fashion, but from both or multiple sides in one scene with some nice sort of panning effects. So it's, from a directorial standpoint, I think that Ed Byrne pulls off a nice pacing and imbues the movie with a sort of a raw honesty that makes some of those excellent performances pop. Cameron Diaz is perfectly cast as the femme fatale, she plays it with a subtle vulnerability. Jennifer Aniston, also in only her third big screen role, uses her, girl next door charm to play the aggrieved wife to very good effect. And Maxine Baines, I'm not too sure how I pronounce her name, who was dating Ed Burns at the time of his first two movies, plays a convincing, mysterious stranger archetype who disrupts the protagonist's life. It's all fairly safe, but there's enough chemistry between the cast members to make this movie feel believable and at times quite touching. Ed Burns clearly wasn't trying to redefine the genre with this movie, but as a partial character study in sort of male stubbornness and male relationships, and to a degree what we might call in these days toxic masculinity, I think it does work. So onto the soundtrack and how it sort of interweaves with the movie. Tom's music filters through in wonderfully unexpected moments, and mainly it's the themes from Walls, Angel Dream, and Hope You Never. But it's all very complimentary and lends a very Americana rootsy vibe to what is a very Americana rootsy story. So a shrewd move by a young director to approach someone like Petty to score this movie. More so maybe even than the more obvious choice that would have been Springsteen, given his ties to the film's setting of New York. But I guess, Streets of Philadelphia was a hit in 94. This movie comes out in 96. So maybe it would have been a little route one for Burns to go that direction. And also maybe, Springsteen might have been just a slightly out of his reach. I don't know. Overall, I basically enjoyed this movie, and I came away feeling that the characters were three-dimensional and had developmental arcs to varying degrees over the 90 minutes. And the music definitely enhanced my enjoyment of it. And you know what? I'd probably watch this again. Not in the next year or so, but I think I'd throw that on again sometime to watch maybe with my wife. I think it's a decent little movie. All in all, I'd give the movie a 6.5 out of 10. Okay, well, that's enough for this week. Next week, we'll be kicking off season 11 of the Tom Petty Project podcast proper. Oh, that's an alliteration, isn't it? But before I sign off, I just wanted to let you all know that I will be in Gainesville for the rescheduled Tom Petty weekend. I just had to finalize hotels and rebook my flights, and I'll be prepping to see a few of you in a few weeks. I'm also really looking forward to starting my deep dive into what has to be the single most overlooked or maybe underappreciated or unusual Heartbreakers album. And despite Tom's apathy towards it, I'm sure there's going to be plenty of treasure once we start scratching past the surface of these songs. Tom Petty Project is a proud member of the Deep Dive Podcast Network. Go check us out on Twitter at Deep Dive Podnet. You can also check out my other podcast, Seaside Pod Review, a Queen podcast that I do with my best friend Randy Woods, who performs all the music in this show. You can check out the Ultimate Catalog Clash that I co-host with my very good friend Corey Morissette, and we are covering Dire Straits this season 4. It's been a wild ride. I think this week the Love Over Gold episode has just dropped, so go check that out. A lot of fun. Corey's listening to all those songs, actually. I was going to say all of those songs for the first time, which has been a bit of a blast. And you should also check out this fantastic podcast.
This is Eric Senich, host of Booked on Rock. Join me for deep dive discussions of the greatest stories in rock history from the authors who've written all about them.
Ed Van Halen, one of the world's greatest guitarists. He ended on a great note, just like one of his solos.
And those who were there when they happened.
I'm fishing and I'm hearing Sweet Home, Alabama, 6 miles to where I'm fishing.
Find Booked on Rock wherever you listen to your favorite podcasts, or just go to bookedonrock.com.
Don't forget to follow me on Facebook, Instagram, Threads, and YouTube at The Tom Petty Project, and on Twitter at Tom Petty Project. Go follow, like, subscribe as applicable, and all those things. And please leave a review or a rating if you haven't done that. Talk to me on social media, because I do enjoy reading out your comments on the show. And as a weekly reminder, the Tom Petty Project is not affiliated with the Tom Petty Estate in any way. So when you're looking for Tom's music, please visit official streaming platforms or go to your local independent record seller to grab some actual physical media. I tell you this every week. I don't know how many of you do it. Go do it. Support local businesses, folks. Don't forget to check out the Tom Petty Nation and Tom Petty Fans Forever groups on Facebook. And check out Tom Petty Radio on Channel 31 on Sirius XM. Until we meet again next week, keep listening to and sharing Tom's music. Try to be kind. Try to say I love you to someone at least once a day. Stay safe and healthy, and I'll be back with you next week to talk about the first song from Songs and Music from She's the One, the psychedelic-infused Walls Circus. Bye-bye.